I'm not sure really how I was originally interested in travel. This is a picture of me aged 5. You'll see the pilot's type in there. But in fact, I didn't want to be a pilot. You know how often children are asked what would they like to be when they grow up. And once in the presence of my parents, friends of theirs said to me, well, what would you like to be when you grow up? And partly lived in London. And my answer was, I want to be a tube train driver. My father was a little horrified. He said, why do you want to be a tube train driver? And I said, I want to travel. And his answer to that was, you'll travel from one end of the tunnel to the other. But in fact, as was mentioned, I was originally inspired by the Belgian cartoon character Tintin. Just a slight correction, I did leave home aged 12 without papers or airline ticket. I did tell my parents that I was going to Paris for the week. They obviously didn't believe me, and I had a very interesting week, which led me to go on to do further travels. But my real desire was to become an artist, a painter. I went to art school, but the travels always remained there. And in 1982, I applied for a Winston Churchill Memorial Travel Fellowship, which I won to follow ancient trade routes from Europe to the Far East, to China. And it was a journey that took some 18 months, traveling often in disguise as an itinerant Muslim without any papers whatsoever. So I left without any visas. And the first of the countries that I encountered problems, as you may well imagine, it was in 1984 at the height of the Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamic Revolution. And close to the border, this type of graffiti greeted me. Americans always bare-chested, and here impaled on the halo of the Statue of Liberty. But everywhere, great, I would say, support for the Islamic Revolution. And when I saw a mullah counseling a woman in a side street, I thought it would make an interesting picture. It was only when I returned home, I thought this was some exhortation to the Islamic Revolution. But in fact, it reads, gas and water boiler repairs to the left. From there, I had to travel on into Afghanistan, which was at the time when the Soviet army was occupying the country, a ferocious war. And I traveled to the border area, and I was eventually guided into Afghanistan, but an ambush took place, and I lost absolutely everything I had with me. So I literally traveled with only the clothes that I stood up in, and I was absolutely devastated because I entered the second largest city of Afghanistan, Herat, and literally half the city had been razed to the ground. And I traveled for some 6 weeks in that fashion, but unable to document what I was seeing. And at the end of one day, right in the center of Afghanistan, some probably 300 kilometers from the border, I was sitting in a village mosque, and 2 young men came with a patu. It's a kind of blanket tied over their shoulders, which is also used as a prayer mat, a carrier bag. And they went towards the mullah and said, have you seen a foreigner come through the village? And eventually he kind of questioned them a bit more and eventually pointed to me in the corner. And they came over and they untied their patus, and inside was everything that I had lost during the ambush. The cameras, a spare set of clothes. This is the village where the bags were returned to me. In Afghanistan in those days, I often was not allowed to travel as a foreigner. People were not to know that I was a foreigner. You can't just walk into an Afghan village. It would be like us walking into, or me walking into your home unannounced. You'd have to wait on the edge of the village. But in those days, absolutely everyone used to tune into the BBC Persian service. And so where, on the few occasions it was allowed to be known that I was actually from Britain, amazingly, what they call the Resh Safid, the whitebeards, would come forward and they would place their hand on their hearts in the traditional greeting and they would bow down. But with the words in English, they would greet me with, and our next program will be in Persian. I mentioned that I didn't have any papers, and I carried on. I walked all the way across Afghanistan into China, across a border that hadn't been crossed since 1984. And I entered Western China. Eventually, I was caught by the Chinese authorities 4 days into China. And they did allow me to travel for 1 month within China, but in fact I stayed 8 months. And the first 3 months was in the western part of China, known as Xinjiang, populated by Uyghurs. They're a Muslim population. Again, they often also mistook me for one of them, an overseas Chinese Uyghur. And I'd have to be very diplomatic, and I used to explain to them, look, I'm really sorry, I'm not overseas Chinese, I'm not a Uyghur. Sometimes I'd have to explain also I was not a Muslim, because I would greet them in that way. But in one village, as was often the case, anyway, there used to be crowds around me. People just wanted to know who I was. A young man came forward, and he said, well, tell me, how many Uyghurs are there in Englistan? I was a little nervous. I didn't know really what to answer. And again, very apologetically, I said, there are no Uyghurs in England. And he turned around to the assembled crowd, a bit like yourselves, and he announced, he is the only Uyghur living in England. Well, as I realized the Chinese were never going to arrest me, I headed towards Tibet. And again, a lot of them thought I was a Chinese Muslim trader. I would explain. And in this particular location, at the end of the day, one man explained to me, he said, yak backbone properly crushed and mixed with gold dust we use as a contraceptive. I don't know why he was telling me that, but as I left the village the next day, he came running after me and tapped me on the shoulder to explain, it doesn't always work. Well, I mentioned I traveled in disguise, and I have a picture here of actually how I traveled for a year of the journey. And the reason I'm showing you this, because this was taken in Beijing at the end of the journey. The Chinese press wanted to actually write about what had taken place. But the caption underneath read, the Imam of Beijing with Nick Danziger. And in parentheses underneath, Nick Danziger is on the right. I returned to the UK and wanted to go back to painting, and I had great difficulty. I lived in a council flat in the East End of London. I ended up working in Paul Smith's flagship store as a cashier. The painting I got down to was painting and decorating. And a book was published, and it really changed my life because I started getting offers to go off and do photo essays. And the first one was when Saddam Hussein was gassing his own Kurdish population, maybe 26 years ago, Halabja, some of you may have heard of it. As I approached the border, I ended up in a refugee camp where the unarmed civilians were gathering as they fled across the border. But whilst I was there, gunshots started to ring out, and the unarmed civilians were being shot by the Turkish soldiers who were there to protect them. And this series of images of those incidents, the men and the injured, both dead and the dying. And what I realized was that there is this extreme violence in so many corners of the world, but it's the casualties, the unheard of casualties. We hear about the numbers, the facts and the figures, how many die and how many injured. But imagine as a small child witnessing a loved one meting out a terrible end. And today, 9 out of 10 people in areas of conflict are civilians, those that do not participate in the conflict. So I returned to Afghanistan because, as I mentioned, a lot of Afghan villages, you're not accepted, you have to wait to be allowed into the village. On that first trip, I didn't meet one single woman. I spent over 2 months in Afghanistan. Actually, no, I tell a lie. I did see one woman who was probably a grandmother, and she was teased remorselessly because an outsider had seen her. So I went back to the government side, where there were women who were very, very worried about a mujahideen victory. They didn't support the government. But also, again, to concentrate on the civilians. Here a young man being indoctrinated into the revolution here on International Women's Day in 1989. And if they're not being indoctrinated, well, they're often running the economy because the men are out either fighting or fled as refugees. And the risks that they take, a young boy going into a minefield to collect wood so that his family can purchase bread. He's just left a minefield. They know the risks, but there is no choice for them. The only growth industry over the last 30 years in Afghanistan has been the building of prosthetics limbs. This at the International Committee of the Red Cross First Orthopedic Center in the capital, Kabul. And there we are. That's what they're fighting for, to get loaves of bread out of the bakery. And on my first visit to the government side, I came across a mental asylum where there was absolutely no medical help for those who have severe mental health problems. The violent patients, no treatment, no medication, no psychologists or psychiatrists. And here you can see in the picture, the man is actually chained around the ankles to the wall. Not only the insane, and I don't use that word pejoratively, but also children. Children perfectly normal, but with nowhere else to house them. 2 sisters, aged 2 and 3, Khadija and Farishta, and a boy who was eventually brought to that center, who had his wheelchair stolen when the Mujahideen took victory in Kabul, the capital. The replacement wheelchair had the tires stolen off the wheelchair. So there was the complete breakdown of law and order. That's not Coca-Cola bottles, they're actually rocket-propelled grenades. It's a taxi where the people, the passengers, were pulled out of the taxi. So when the Taliban came to victory in 1996, they were welcomed. Because particularly the men, it didn't matter if the women, as they were told that they could no longer work because a male cousin would get the job. The girls were told that they could no longer receive an education, they could not go to school, and often women were not allowed to receive medical attention. A lot of us now say it's their faith, it's their religion. It's not. It's their culture. And what I would say, it is the male culture. It is still the case today, even though much of Afghanistan is free, that it's a husband, a son, a brother, or a father who will not allow his daughter, wife, or sister to receive medical attention. In 2005, I began a project on the United Nations Millennium Development Goals to bring people out of extreme poverty. What is extreme poverty? This is Abbas, who started going down a mine age 13. Here he's 15. His boss plunged to his death a year before I took this picture. Abbas works 363 days a year. He has 2 days off, and he works 8 to 9 hours every day to mine for gold. But he's never seen gold. He doesn't know why we value gold. Never seen a bracelet made of gold, or watch, or chain, and yet on every single day he risks his life. That's the mine. No security devices whatsoever. And this project, which is ongoing, I'm revisiting people every 5 years. So in 2010 I returned. Abbas was no longer in the mine. He said, would I like to meet his mother and his wife? So I went to the village some 15 kilometers from where the mine is, and there's his mother and his wife. I'm not sure if you can tell which is with. That's Aisha, a 13-year-old who he has married. It's illegal, even in that country, to marry underage girls. And yet once you're married, it's considered legal. Or take the case of Husseini and Husseina. The mother was having terrible labor pains. It took her 3 days to raise the money for the petrol to take her the 72 kilometers to the nearest hospital. She gave birth to the first of the twins. She didn't know another one was on the way, neither did the people in the hospital, and she died in childbirth. The aunt here in this picture was worried as to how she would be able to feed them. 5 years later, I returned very quickly. I found the family. I say the family. I wondered where Husseini and Husseini were. And the aunt told me that they had died several months after my visit because, indeed, she wasn't able to purchase milk powder to feed them. And what about Bridget? Not an uncommon story. She needed mathematics exercise books, pens and paper to continue at school. $1 worth of school equipment. And she was determined to stay at school, and the only way she knew how to raise the money was to enter the sex trade. 5 years later, many of the girls are still doing this so that they can remain at school. They're so poor that they go to the woman on the left, known as a queen bee, to receive makeup and second-hand clothes for their evening. 5 years later, I've re-met up with Bridget. She's now HIV positive. Everyone knows the dangers of HIV. And yet, as she says, how can we as young girls protect ourselves? And this is Selvi in India. And for many years, we've militated for free antiretroviral treatment. She died. There's Kausalya and her son. The daughter, Kausalya, unable to pay the rickshaw driver the money to take her to the hospital on the night she died. Selvi died on the pavement next to her 2 children. The father did come back into the story to support his children. He said he did give the virus to his wife. But his dilemma today is, does he feed himself to prolong his life, or does he feed his children? And as he said, who is going to help them once I die? And schools. The second MDG, universal primary education. So many countries are now lauding the fact that they have reached that goal, as this particular country. But take a look at this particular classroom. Most, again, don't have pens or papers to write with. There are 125 children in this classroom. So maybe they've reached the figure. We're talking about quantity. But what about the quality? The teacher runs out of chalk before the end of the year and can no longer write on the blackboard. 5 years later, in 2010, this particular picture, in this particular classroom, 133 children. There are positive stories. This is Eugenia in Latin America. The father did decide to sell half his flock of llamas so that the daughter could go to school, because boys are always favored. It was considered too dangerous, lack of security, to send her to school 2.5 hours walk from the village. But he's bought a little plot of land outside a city center to send his children to school. And you can see Eugenia here 5 years later, and indeed the younger sister now at school. Remember the earlier picture of the children in the mental asylum? Perfectly normal. I was not only worried about them being socialized into the insanity around them. The boy as well sat down, and he had taken into a government orphanage. But 2 weeks before the Taliban came to power, I took them out on a holiday. I'd known them for 8 years. But I knew in 1996, in September, when the Taliban came to power, their lives would end. I didn't have a home, I didn't have a wife, but I decided to adopt them on my own because I couldn't leave them behind. And you'll see how radically their lives have changed. When they left Afghanistan, aged 10, 11, and 13, they couldn't read or write. And thanks partly to Monaco, because I give a lot of credit to themselves, I'm extraordinarily proud of them. Today, they can speak 3 languages and read and write in 2 languages. One works in the hospital here in Monaco until very recently. She's now a mother herself. I'm now subsequently married, so I have 3 more children. It's a very large family, and you can see us here all gathered together. We don't have enough room to sit around a table at the end of the day. But we talk, and we've talked a lot about small things. And what I hear so often today is, well, I can't do much, faced with the enormity of problems around the world today. But just to give you an idea, people don't give because they think that $1 or $2 can't make a change. I brought a tin, because that's a tin of milk powder. Would Husseini and Husseina have lived on less than 50 cents a day? Would their life have been prolonged? Or what about the couple of liters of petrol that might have got Aisha, the mother, to hospital quicker? Or Bridget, $1 in her particular country to stay at school. She now faces a life of sex work. Or indeed, think about a classroom. Could none of us afford a box of chalk? Small items that can radically change the life, not of hundreds or thousands, but millions across the world. Thank you very much.